The day my family found out I owned the building their business was renting from, my sister called me a liar to my face in front of a room full of people, and then she went completely silent when I laid the deed on the table in front of her. Before I tell you how this happened, let me take you back, because none of it makes sense unless you understand where I started. If you're watching this from your car, your kitchen, or your break room, type where you're tuning in from down in the comments. And if stories about quiet people who get underestimated speak to you, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because you're going to want to see how this one ends. My name is Alina Marsh. I'm 33 years old and I grew up in Westfield Heights, a comfortable suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, in a house my father bought with the income from his cardiology practice. My mother had been a real estate agent for a decade before she quit to raise my sister and me, and even after she stopped working, she never stopped talking about property values, square footage, and which neighborhoods were going somewhere, and which ones weren't. My older sister, Vanessa, was 3 years ahead of me in every sense that mattered to my parents. She went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship, then straight through to law school, then into a downtown firm that handled corporate litigation. She was, from the time I can remember, the proof that our family produced winners. I was the other kind of proof. Not a failure exactly, but a disappointment that nobody quite knew how to categorize. I was quiet as a kid, more comfortable with numbers than with people, and I spent my allowance not on clothes or movies, but on a used calculator with financial functions that I'd found at a garage sale for $4. I used to build little spreadsheets tracking my birthday money, calculating what it would be worth in 5 years if I put it in a savings account instead of spending it. My father found one of those printouts once, taped to my bedroom wall next to a poster of a horse, and he laughed, not cruelly, but in that particular way he had of finding me amusing rather than impressive. "Look at this," he said to my mother. "She's 12 and she's already worried about compound interest." Meanwhile, Vanessa's worried about her mock trial arguments. That was the shape of things for as long as I can remember. Vanessa's ambitions were serious. Mine were cute. When I told my family, at 17, that I wanted to study urban planning and real estate economics instead of pre-law or pre-med, my father actually put his fork down at dinner. That's how I remember it, the specific detail of the fork clinking against the plate. "Real estate," he said, like I'd told him I wanted to sell vacuum cleaners door to door. "Alina, you're a smart girl. Why would you want to spend your life dealing with tenants and toilets?" My mother, who had spent 10 years of her own life doing exactly that, didn't defend the profession. Instead, she said something that stuck with me for the next 15 years. "There's a difference between being in real estate and being someone who matters in a room, sweetheart. Your sister is going to matter in a room." I didn't have a comeback for that at 17. I just nodded and went back to my food, and later that night, I opened my laptop and looked up the salary data for commercial real estate analysts. And then I looked up the salary data for junior associates at law firms, and I realized something that I never said out loud to anyone in my family for the next decade and a half. The numbers weren't nearly as far apart as they thought, and in the long run, if you understood how ownership worked instead of just employment, they weren't even close. I went to Ohio University, not Ohio State, which itself was treated as a minor scandal, and I studied finance with a concentration in real estate. I graduated with a decent GPA and no debt, because I'd worked part-time the entire way through at a property management office downtown, learning things my classmates weren't learning in their textbooks. I learned how a triple net lease worked. I learned how landlords structured holding companies to separate liability from ownership. I learned that the person whose name is on the sign out front of a business is almost never the person who actually owns the building that business sits inside. I learned that real wealth in real estate doesn't come from being flashy. It comes from being patient and boring for a very long time. At family gatherings during those college years, the questions were always the same. "So what exactly do you do with property management?" my aunt would ask, in a tone that suggested she already knew the answer was disappointing. "Are you going to be a realtor, like showing houses?" My uncle once asked me at Christmas if I was going to get a real job eventually, once you figure out what you want to do. I was 20 years old at the time, ready managing 3 duplexes for my employer's portfolio, already understanding cap rates and depreciation schedules better than most people twice my age. But to my family, none of that registered as a career. It registered as a placeholder, something I was doing until I figured out what Vanessa had already figured out. Vanessa, for her part, was never outright cruel to me. That's important to say, because this isn't a story about a villain twirling a mustache. Vanessa was, and is, a genuinely accomplished person, and for most of our lives she simply didn't think about me very much one way or the other. When she did think about me, it was usually through the lens of managing me, the way you'd manage a slightly awkward cousin at a family event. At her law school graduation, she introduced me to her friends as my sister, she's into houses, which wasn't wrong exactly, but it collapsed years of specific, technical work into something that sounded like a hobby. I stood there in my one good blazer, 22 years old, having just accepted a position as a junior acquisitions analyst at a regional investment firm, and I let it go, the way I always let things go, because arguing about it felt exhausting and pointless. I want to be specific about a few incidents, because I think the specifics are what made the years accumulate into something heavier than any single moment. When I turned 25, my parents threw Vanessa an engagement party for her and her now husband, Dave, who worked in commercial banking. It was a beautiful event at a venue downtown, the kind of place with exposed brick and string lights that costs $11,000 to rent for an evening, a number I know because I happened to see the invoice on the kitchen counter when I was helping set up. During the toasts, my father stood up and talked for almost 10 minutes about Vanessa's achievements, her law degree, her clerkship, her engagement to a brilliant young banker. Then, almost as an afterthought, he gestured toward me and said, "And of course we're proud of Alina too, she's doing well in her little real estate thing." The room laughed, not unkindly, but they laughed, and I smiled and raised my glass because that's what you do. 2 years later, at Thanksgiving, my mother was telling her sister about a house she and my father were thinking of buying near the lake, and I mentioned, gently, that based on recent comparable sales in that specific zip code, the asking price seemed inflated by almost 15%, and that I could pull the actual county assessor data if she wanted to see it before they made an offer. My mother waved her hand at me. "Alina, sweetheart, we're not buying a duplex. This is a real house." The distinction she was drawing wasn't about the type of property. It was about the type of expertise she assumed I had, which in her mind was small, cheap, unserious. She and my father ended up overpaying for that house by almost $40,000, a fact I know because I looked up the final sale price a year later out of a curiosity I'm not proud of. There's another memory from those college years that I still think about, from the summer after my sophomore year, when I took an unpaid internship at a small property management office, instead of the paid marketing internship my mother had lined up for me through a friend of hers. I remember sitting in my mother's kitchen, explaining that the unpaid position would teach me acquisitions and asset management, real skills, while the marketing internship would have me making coffee and updating spreadsheets for a cousin's friend's company. My mother listened, arms crossed, and said, "Alina, unpaid means nobody thinks it's worth paying for. That should tell you something." I took the unpaid internship anyway, and within 6 weeks I was sitting in on due diligence calls for a 12-unit acquisition, learning how a rent roll actually got built from raw lease data, how a capital expenditure budget got forecasted 5 years out. Nobody in my family ever asked me a single question about what I learned that summer. They asked about Vanessa's mock trial regional finals, which she'd placed second in, for almost the entire month of August. There was also the matter of my student loans, or rather, the complete absence of them, which nobody in my family seemed to register as remarkable. I graduated from Ohio University with zero debt because I had worked consistently through all 4 years, saved aggressively, and chosen a state school specifically because the numbers made sense to me even at 18. Vanessa graduated law school with just under $110,000 in debt, a fact my parents discussed at length, with concern, at multiple family dinners, framing it as an acceptable and even admirable cost of ambition. "That's what it takes to build something real," my father said once, referring to Vanessa's debt load like it was evidence of seriousness. Nobody ever rammed my debt-free graduation the same way. It was just Alina being careful, being small, being the version of responsible that didn't cost anything to be proud of. By the time I was 28, I had left the regional investment firm and started doing something my family didn't fully understand and, frankly, that I didn't advertise very loudly. I had been saving aggressively since my first paycheck, living well below my means in a modest one-bedroom apartment, instead of the kind of place my salary could technically afford, and I had started using that savings, along with what I'd learned about distressed and undervalued commercial property, to buy my first building. It wasn't glamorous. It was a rundown four-unit mixed-use property on the edge of a neighborhood that was starting to turn around. Purchased through a small holding company I formed called Fairview Property Partners LLC, a name generic enough that nobody would ever connect it to me by accident. I renovated it slowly, using contractors I'd vetted through years of industry contacts, and within 18 months it was fully leased and cash flowing. I didn't tell my family about it, partly because I knew, with a certainty that had been built over 20 years of dinner table comments, exactly how the conversation would go. It would become a story about how Alina bought a little building, said with the same tone my mother used for little real estate thing, and it would sit alongside Vanessa's partnership track and Dave's promotion to VP as a minor footnote. So I kept it separate. I kept almost everything about my real financial life separate from my family, and over the following 5 years, that separation became the foundation of everything. I remember the closing on that first building with a clarity that surprises me now, years later. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and I sat in a small conference room at the title company with my attorney, a woman named Patricia Ose, who I'd found through a referral from my old employer, and I signed my name to a stack of documents that felt, in the moment, both enormous and strangely quiet. There was no toast afterward. No family gathered to celebrate. I drove straight from the closing to my job, because I hadn't taken the day off, and I sat through a 2 o'clock portfolio review meeting like nothing had happened, carrying the knowledge of what I'd just done like a stone in my pocket that only I could feel the weight of. That night I ordered takeout, ate it alone at my kitchen table, and opened a spreadsheet to start building out the renovation budget. That was the entire celebration. A spreadsheet and cold noodles. The renovation itself taught me more than any class I'd taken in college. The building had been neglected for years. The previous owner, an elderly man who had stopped keeping up with maintenance long before he decided to sell, and I spent those first 18 months learning things no finance degree prepares you for: how to read a contractor's bid and know when it was padded, how to negotiate with a plumber who assumed, because I was a woman in my late 20s showing up alone to inspect a boiler, that he could quote me double what the job was actually worth. I learned to walk into those conversations with printed comparable quotes already in hand, numbers I'd sourced from 2 other contractors beforehand, and I watched more than one vendor's estimate quietly correct itself once they realized I wasn't going to be talked past. By the time the building was fully leased, I had 4 tenants paying a combined rent that covered the mortgage, the taxes, the insurance, and left roughly $1,100 a month in positive cash flow, a number that felt, at the time, like the most significant financial achievement of my life, more significant to me privately than any of Vanessa's public accolades, even though nobody outside my own head knew it existed. I used every dollar of that cash flow for the next 2 years to build up a reserve, refusing to draw a personal salary from it even when my regular paycheck was tight, because I understood something my family had never taught me and that I'd had to learn entirely on my own: the difference between income and ownership. Income was what my family understood and respected: a title, a salary, a promotion announced at a dinner. Ownership was slower, quieter, and almost invisible until the moment it wasn't. I was building ownership, deliberately, patiently, while my family continued to measure my worth in the only currency they knew how to read. The second property came 2 years after the first, a small strip of 4 retail units in a neighborhood that was, at the time, still considered rough by most of the people I knew, including, if I'm honest, some of my own colleagues. I bought it below market because the previous owner was motivated to sell quickly following a divorce, and I remember walking the property with Patricia and my new property manager. A sharp, no-nonsense woman named Carol Bishop, who I'd hired specifically because she had 15 years of commercial management experience and absolutely no patience for being underestimated herself, something I found I respected enormously once I got to know her. Carol looked at that strip of retail units, half of them vacant, graffiti on the back wall, and said, "Give me 8 months and this will be full." It took her 7. By the time it was fully leased, the neighborhood had genuinely begun to turn. new coffee shops opening 2 blocks over, a boutique fitness studio moving in down the street, and the value of that property had appreciated by nearly 30% from what I'd paid for it less than 2 years earlier. I used the cash flow from the first building, combined with continued aggressive saving, to acquire a second property, then a third. I brought on a property management company to handle day-to-day operations so that no tenant, no vendor, no leasing agent ever had a reason to know my name specifically. Every lease was signed on behalf of Fairview Property Partners, LLC, later restructured into a slightly larger holding entity called Fairview Holdings Group, as my portfolio expanded into small commercial retail and office space. By the time I was 32, I owned, through this structure, 6 properties across the greater Columbus metro area, a mix of mixed-use buildings, small retail strips, and one 3-story office building downtown that I'd acquired at auction for a fraction of its eventual value after doing months of quiet due diligence that the other bidders hadn't bothered with. My family, during this same stretch of years, continued to see me as they always had. I was still into real estate, still the sister with the practical, unglamorous job, still the one whose accomplishments got a single sentence at family gatherings while Vanessa's got 10 minutes. At my father's 60th birthday party, he introduced me to a colleague of his as my daughter who manages properties for a company downtown, which was technically true and completely misleading, since I wasn't managing anyone else's properties by that point. I was managing my own portfolio, worth, by conservative estimate, just over $4 million in equity, through a management company that itself worked for me. I let the misunderstanding stand. I always let the misunderstanding stand. There was a particular Christmas, when I was 30, that I still think about more than almost any other memory from those years. My cousin Rachel, 2 years younger than me, had just been promoted to a marketing director role at a mid-sized consumer goods company, and the entire dinner conversation orbited around her promotion, her new title, her expanded team, her upcoming relocation to a nicer apartment that came with the raise. My aunt asked me at one point, almost as a courtesy, what was new with me. I mentioned briefly that I had just closed on a third property, a small mixed-use building near the Arts District. My aunt nodded, said that's nice, honey, and turned immediately back to Rachel to ask a follow-up question about her new team's headcount. I remember sitting there with my wine glass, doing quiet math in my head, the kind of math I did often in those years as a private coping mechanism. Rachel's promotion came with a raise to $92,000 a year. My third acquisition alone had added roughly $200,000 in equity to my net worth the moment the ink dried on the closing documents, not counting the 4 properties I already owned. Nobody at that table would have believed the number if I'd said it out loud, so I didn't say it out loud. I just smiled and asked Rachel more questions about her new team, because that's what the room wanted from me, interest in everyone else's ambitions and silence about my own. I also want to mention my grandmother, my mother's mother, who passed away when I was 31, because she was the one person in my extended family who ever asked me real questions about my work, and who never once made me feel small for the answers. She had grown up poor in rural Ohio, and had a lifelong, almost reverent respect for property ownership that the rest of my family, comfortable and college-educated for 2 generations now, had lost touch with. During her last few years, whenever I visited her at the assisted living facility, she'd ask me detailed questions. How many units did I own now? Was I keeping enough in reserve for repairs? Was I making sure my leases protected me if a tenant stopped paying? She was the only person who ever called what I was doing impressive, the only person who ever said, plainly, "You're going to end up owning more than any of them, and none of them are going to see it coming." I used to think she was just being kind to me because I visited her more often than Vanessa did. Looking back, I think she simply understood, better than anyone else in the family, exactly what quiet, patient accumulation actually looks like from the inside, because she'd lived a version of it herself, decades earlier, in circumstances far harder than mine. If you've ever had one person in your family, even just one, who actually saw what you were building before anyone else did, comment below and tell me who that person was for you, because I think those people matter more than we usually say out loud, and I'd love to hear about yours. If you're the kind of person who's ever sat quietly through a family dinner, knowing something about your own life that nobody else in the room understood. Comment below with just the word quiet, because I think there are more of us than people realize, and I want to see how many. The thing about my family's assumptions is that they weren't just about me personally. They shaped how Vanessa and Dave made real decisions, decisions with real financial consequences, because they had built an entire worldview where competence and prestige were the same thing, and where my particular competence simply didn't register. This becomes important because 2 years ago, Vanessa left her firm to start her own boutique litigation practice with two partners from her old office, focusing on high-value commercial disputes. It was, by every account, an ambitious and well-executed move. She needed office space, something that projected exactly the right amount of understated success, in exactly the right part of downtown Columbus, close to the courthouse, and to the kind of clients who expect their attorneys to have a certain address. She and her partners found a building on a corner lot 3 blocks from the courthouse, a beautifully restored 3-story structure with exposed brick interiors, tall windows, and a location that couldn't have been better if she'd designed it herself. It was, in fact, the same building I had acquired at auction 2 years earlier. Vanessa signed a 5-year commercial lease with Fairview Holdings Group, negotiated entirely through the property management company I employed, a woman named Carol Bishop, who handled all tenant-facing communication, so that my name never appeared on a single document Vanessa ever saw. Vanessa knew her landlord only as Fairview, a faceless, professional entity that responded to maintenance requests promptly, kept the building immaculate, and according to her own words at a family dinner 8 months into the lease, was actually one of the more reasonable commercial landlords her partners had dealt with in their careers. She had no idea. None. I sat across the table from her at that dinner, eating my mother's pot roast, listening to my sister praise my own company without knowing it, and I said nothing, because at that point saying something felt less like an opportunity and more like a landmine I wasn't ready to step on. The inciting moment came 7 months later, at my parents' anniversary dinner, an event my mother had been planning for months at a private event, space my father had rented for the occasion, 40 guests, a plated dinner, the whole production. I arrived a little late, having come straight from a closing on my 7th property, a small strip retail center on the north side of the city that I'd been negotiating for 4 months. I was still in my work clothes, a simple gray blazer, because I hadn't had time to go home and change, and my mother noticed immediately. "You couldn't have worn something nicer for our anniversary?" she asked, not unkindly but pointedly, in front of my aunt and 2 family friends standing near the entrance. "I was closing on a property this afternoon," I said. "I came straight from the title company." My father, overhearing this, chuckled and said, loud enough for the small cluster of people to hear, "Still playing landlord, huh? When are you going to do something with a little more ambition, kiddo?" A few people laughed, not maliciously, just easily, the way people laugh at a joke they've heard variations of for 15 years. I want to describe the room a little more, because I think the setting matters. It was a warm evening in early June, the kind of event space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a small courtyard, string lights strung between 2 young maple trees my father had specifically requested when he booked the venue, because he remembered my mother mentioning once, years earlier, that she loved the way lights looked strung through leaves. There was a 3-piece jazz combo playing quietly near the bar, and waitstaff circulating with trays of the kind of small, elegant appetizers that cost more per bite than they had any right to. 40 guests, most of them people I had known my entire life, aunts and uncles and family friends, and 2 of my father's medical colleagues and their wives, all dressed well, all comfortable, all part of the social fabric my parents had built over 35 years of marriage in that community. I remember scanning the room when I walked in and feeling, as I often did at these events, like a slightly different species than everyone else there, present but not quite legible in the same way. It might have ended there, another small humiliation absorbed and filed away, except that Vanessa chose that exact moment to walk over, wine glass in hand, clearly having overheard. "Speaking of landlords," she said, half laughing, "you would not believe the ridiculous letter we just got from our building management. Fairview is raising our rent by almost 12% at renewal, can you believe that? For an old building 3 blocks from the courthouse." I told Dave, This is exactly the kind of thing that happens when you're dealing with some faceless corporate landlord who's never even set foot in the building. They don't care about relationships, they just care about maximizing every dollar. My mother nodded sympathetically. My father shook his head at the state of modern business. And then Vanessa turned to me, still smiling, and said the words that I have replayed in my head many times since. See, this is the kind of thing you should be studying, Alina, how these big landlord companies operate, instead of whatever small stuff you're doing. Maybe you'd actually learn something useful for once. I want to be honest about what happened inside me in that moment, because it wasn't rage, and it wasn't even hurt exactly, not in the sharp way it would have hurt me at 17 or even at 25. It was something quieter and colder, a kind of clarity. 12%. I remembered authorizing that renewal adjustment myself 6 weeks earlier, based on comparable market rates for downtown commercial space that Carol Bishop had compiled for me, a completely standard, defensible increase given how much the neighborhood had appreciated since Vanessa's firm signed their original lease. I hadn't thought about the tenant behind that decision as my sister. I'd thought about it as Unit 3B, a professional services tenant, current on rent, low maintenance history, market adjustment justified. And now here she was, calling that decision, my decision, evidence of exactly the kind of small-minded, unambitious thinking she'd spent her whole life associating with me. I didn't say anything at the party. I smiled, actually, and said something forgettable about how commercial leasing could be complicated, and I let the conversation move on to something else, because I have never once in my life been the kind of person who makes a scene at a party, and that wasn't going to be the moment I started. I spent the rest of the evening the way I usually did at family events, quietly, moving between small conversations, helping my mother coordinate the cake cutting, making sure my father's older colleagues had drinks in hand, doing the invisible logistical work that nobody notices until it isn't done. But on the drive home that night, alone in my car, on the same stretch of highway I'd driven 1,000 times, I found myself doing the math again. The private math I'd done at that Christmas dinner years earlier with Rachel, except this time the numbers had a different weight to them. My sister had stood in a room full of people who mattered to her, people whose respect she cared about, and used a decision I had personally made, a decision grounded in real market data and years of careful stewardship of that specific building, as the punchline for a joke about my supposed lack of ambition. And she had done it without any idea that she was doing it, which was somehow worse than if she'd known. It wasn't cruelty. It was just how invisible my actual life had become to the people who were supposed to know me best. I sat in my driveway for almost 20 minutes after I parked, not going inside, just sitting there with the engine off, thinking about my grandmother, about the 18 months of renovation on that first building, about the plumber who tried to double his quote, about Carol's 7 months turning that vacant strip mall into a fully leased asset, about every quiet, unglamorous hour that had gone into building something my own family didn't believe I was capable of building. And I made a decision that I'd been circling around for months, without quite admitting it to myself. I was going to stop hiding. The following Monday, I called Carol Bishop and asked her to schedule a lease renewal meeting with the tenant in Unit 3B, the standard procedure whenever a lease was up for negotiation on terms the tenant wanted to discuss. Normally, Carol would run these meetings entirely herself, since I stayed deliberately behind the scenes, but I told her this time I wanted to attend personally, as a principal of Fairview Holdings. Carol, who had worked for me for 3 years and knew better than to ask unnecessary questions, simply said she'd set it up and asked if there was anything specific I wanted her to prepare. I asked her to pull the complete lease history, the comparable market data we'd used to justify the increase, and the maintenance and improvement records for the building over the past 2 years, all of it organized cleanly, because I wanted every number I said in that meeting to be verifiable on the spot. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 10 days later, in the small conference room on the ground floor of the building itself, a room Vanessa's firm used regularly for depositions. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed the way I actually dress for closings and acquisition meetings, a tailored charcoal suit, not the blazer my mother had criticized, and I sat at the head of the table with Carol beside me and the folder of documents in front of me, and I waited. Carol, sitting beside me, asked quietly if I was sure I wanted to handle this one personally instead of letting her run it the way we normally did. I told her I was sure. She nodded, businesslike as always, and said only, "Then let's make sure every number in that folder is bulletproof, because family or not, she's going to come at this like a lawyer." Carol was right, and I'd already anticipated it, which was why I'd spent the previous weekend cross-checking every comparable lease figure against the county's public filings twice, because I understood, better than almost anyone, that walking into a room with my sister meant walking in with a case that could survive real cross-examination, not just family loyalty. I remember the specific sound of the elevator down the hall, the soft mechanical chime, and then footsteps, two sets, coming closer. I remember straightening the folder in front of me by maybe half an inch, an unnecessary gesture, the kind of thing you do with your hands when your heart rate has climbed slightly and you need somewhere to put the extra energy. I remember thinking, in the last few seconds before the door opened, about my father's fork clinking against his plate 16 years earlier, about my mother's comment that Vanessa was going to matter in a room. And then the door opened. Vanessa walked in with her law partner Michael, a man in his 40s who handled the firm's real estate matters, and for the first 4 seconds after she saw me sitting there, her face did something I had genuinely never seen it do before. Confusion first, the specific confusion of encountering something that doesn't fit any existing category in your mind, then a flicker of something like recognition that she immediately dismissed as impossible. "Alina," she said, "what are you doing here?" I stood up the way I would for any tenant meeting, and I said calmly, "I'm here representing Fairview Holdings Group. I'm the managing member." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Michael actually looked back and forth between us twice. Vanessa laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "That's not funny, Alina. This is a business meeting." "I'm not joking," I said, and I slid the folder across the table toward her, open to the first page, the Certificate of Formation for Fairview Property Partners LLC, filed 6 years earlier, listing me as the sole managing member, alongside the deed transfer records for the building she was currently sitting in, dated to the auction purchased 2 years prior. And behind those, the operating agreement for Fairview Holdings Group, the successor entity, again listing me by name. "This is ridiculous," Vanessa said, and her voice had climbed half an octave, the tone I recognized from every argument we'd had as teenagers. "You're telling me you own this building, the building my firm is in?" "Yes," I said. "I've owned it for 2 years. I acquired it at auction before your firm ever looked at the space." "That's not possible," she said, and this is the moment she said the word that I opened this story with, the word I will never fully forget, even though I understand exactly why she said it. "You're lying. You don't have that kind of money, Alina. I don't know what this is, some kind of joke, or maybe you're fronting for somebody, but there's no way you actually own a commercial building downtown." I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters, not just for the story but for what it says about the years leading up to that moment. I had spent my entire life being told, in 100 small ways, that I wasn't serious, that my ambitions were cute, that my career was a placeholder. I wasn't going to prove that wrong by yelling. I pulled a second document from the folder, a statement from my commercial lender reflecting the financing structure I'd used for the acquisition, and beside it, a summary Carol had prepared at my request, showing the current portfolio of 7 properties held under Fairview Holdings Group, total assessed value, total equity position, all of it. I turned the folder so Vanessa could read it properly, and I said quietly, "I've owned Fairview Property Partners for 6 years. This is my third acquisition. Tion through the current entity. Your firm's lease, the maintenance history, the 12% increase you mentioned at Mom and Dad's anniversary, all of that ran through my desk. I approved it myself, based on the same comparable market data I'm happy to walk you through right now, the same way I would with any tenant." Michael, to his credit, was the first person in the room to fully process what was happening. He picked up the certificate of formation, examined the filing date and the state seal, then looked at the property deed, cross-referencing the parcel number with something on his phone, presumably the county assessor's site, and after about 90 seconds of silence he said, quietly to Vanessa, "This is legitimate. This is all publicly recorded." Vanessa didn't say anything for a long moment. She just stared at the folder in front of her, at my name printed cleanly on document after document, 6 years of ownership she had no idea existed, $4 million in assessed real estate she had spent years assuming I was incapable of even imagining, let alone acquiring. I want to slow down here, because what happened over the next several minutes is the part people always ask me about when I tell this story. Vanessa didn't apologize immediately. I don't think she was capable of it in that moment, not because she's a bad person, but because what was happening genuinely didn't fit inside the version of me she'd carried in her head since we were children. She asked, in a voice much quieter than before, how? Not accusingly this time. Actually curious, maybe for the first time in 15 years. And I told her plainly, without embellishment, and without making it a speech about how she'd underestimated me, because I didn't need to make it a speech. The documents had already made the point. I told her about the first 4-unit building, the 18 months of renovation, the decision to reinvest cash flow instead of drawing it out, the auction purchase of this exact building 2 years earlier, the deliberate decision to keep the ownership behind Carol and the LLC so that every tenant, including her firm, would be treated on the same professional terms. No favoritism, no shortcuts. Then I addressed the actual business matter we were there for, because underneath everything else, there was still a real lease renewal on the table. I explained, calmly, the comparable data behind the 12% adjustment, showed her 3 recent comparable leases in the immediate area that had renewed at higher rates, and told her that as the landlord, I was willing to negotiate the specific terms the same way I would with any tenant, a slightly longer lease term in exchange for a smaller increase, or a shorter escalation schedule spread over 2 years instead of one, whatever made sense for her firm's cash flow. I wasn't there for revenge. I want to be honest about that, because I think it would have been easy in that meeting to make her sit there and feel small the way I had felt small at 100 family dinners. I didn't do that. I did my job, the same job I'd been quietly doing for 6 years, and I let the facts speak. Before Vanessa and Michael left that first meeting, there was one more exchange that I think about often. Michael, still holding the deed transfer document, looked up at me and asked, with genuine professional curiosity rather than any lingering skepticism, how large the full portfolio actually was, and whether I'd finance the acquisitions conventionally or through some kind of syndicated structure. It was, I realized, the first time in years that anyone in a room connected to my family had asked me a technical question about my work expecting a technical answer, rather than a simplified version suitable for someone who wasn't really expected to understand the details. I answered him fully, walking through the financing on each property, the blended loan-to-value ratio across the portfolio, the reserve policy Carol, and I maintained for capital expenditures. Vanessa sat there listening to this exchange, and I watched something shift on her face as she realized that the conversation happening in front of her, between her law partner and her sister, was a conversation between 2 professionals discussing real numbers. A conversation she would have had no trouble accepting as legitimate if it hadn't been me on the other side of the table. Vanessa ended up signing a renewed 5-year lease 12 days later, with a slightly modified escalation structure that Carol and I worked out to be fair to both sides, the same structure I would have offered any tenant with a solid payment history and a long-term commitment to the space. But the business outcome was never really the point of this story. The point was everything that happened afterward, inside my family, once the truth was impossible to unknow. My mother found out 2 days after the meeting, when Vanessa called her, apparently still somewhat in shock. To relay what had happened, my mother called me that evening and her first words were not congratulations. They were, "Why didn't you tell us?" I told her the truth. I said I didn't tell them because for as long as I could remember, nothing I did in this field had ever been treated as serious and I'd stopped expecting it to be. There was a long silence on the phone, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, quietly, "The house by the lake. You told us the price was inflated." "By about 15%, I said. "You were right," she said. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was the first time in my life my mother had ever said those 3 words to me about anything related to my work. My mother, in the weeks that followed, did something I hadn't expected, which was to start reevaluating her own career, or at least the way she talked about it. She had spent a decade as a real estate agent before deciding, when Vanessa and I were small, that it was more sensible to stay home, and I had always sensed, underneath her comments about me needing to matter in a room, a kind of buried defensiveness about her own choices, as if belittling my version of a similar career somehow protected her from having to examine why she'd walked away from hers. About 6 weeks after the reveal, she called me one evening and asked if I'd ever consider taking her on in some capacity, even informally, to help her understand the investment side of the business the way she'd once understood the sales side. We started meeting for coffee every couple of weeks after that, and I taught her how to read a cap rate, how to evaluate a rent roll, the things nobody had ever bothered explaining to her when she was licensed and working full-time in the field. She told me once, over coffee, that she wished someone had explained ownership to her the way she was only now hearing it from me, at 58 years old, and that she suspected she would have made very different choices in her 20s if she had understood the difference between being an agent and being an owner. My father's reaction took longer, and it was, in its own way, more complicated. He didn't call me right away. Instead, about a week later, he asked if I would come by the house to go over some numbers with him, which was, I realized, his way of asking to understand what I actually did without having to directly admit he'd misunderstood it for 15 years. We sat at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd laughed at my compound interest printout when I was 12, and I walked him through my portfolio, the acquisition strategy, the financing structures, the cash flow model. He asked good questions, the kind of precise, technical questions I'd learned to expect from smart people encountering something unfamiliar for the first time. At the end of it, he sat back and was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I always told people you were doing well." I don't think I understood what well actually meant. It wasn't a full accounting of 15 years of comments, but from my father, it was close to everything I'd ever wanted him to say. Dave, Vanessa's husband, actually became one of the more interesting figures in the aftermath, because his reaction was almost entirely practical. Within a month, he'd asked to meet with me, not as family, but professionally, to understand the acquisition strategy I'd used, since his bank handled commercial lending, and he was, in his words, embarrassed that I've been underwriting loans for buildings like this for a decade, and my own sister-in-law was quietly out executing the exact strategy I evaluate on paper every week. That meeting turned into an ongoing professional relationship, and 6 months later his bank ended up financing my 8th acquisition, a small mixed-use property near the university, at terms that were, I'll admit, better than I would have gotten from a lender who didn't already trust my track record. The consequences, if you want to call them that, rippled outward in smaller ways too. My aunt, who had once asked if I was going to get a real job, began introducing me at gatherings as my niece, the real estate investor, a title that would have been laughable to her a year earlier. The family friends who had chuckled at my father's, still playing landlord comment at the anniversary party found out about all of it eventually, the way these things travel through a social circle, and several of them awkwardly sought me out afterward to ask, half joking and half serious, if I had any advice for their own investment plans. I gave what advice I could, without any satisfaction in the reversal, because that was never really what I wanted. My cousin Rachel, the one whose marketing promotion had eclipsed my 3rd acquisition so completely at that Christmas dinner years earlier, actually reached out to me directly about 4 months after the story spread through the family. She admitted, with more honesty than I expected, that she'd always assumed I was drifting a little professionally, never landing on anything as concrete as her own career path, and that hearing the actual numbers had forced her to reconsider not just her assumptions about me, but the entire framework she'd used to measure success in the family more broadly. A framework built almost entirely around titles and promotions, rather than actual accumulated wealth or ownership. We ended up having a longer, more honest conversation than we'd had in years, and she later told me it was the first time she'd genuinely sat down and calculated her own net worth, only to realize that despite the director title and the raises, she was, financially, starting from close to zero after years of rent payments and no real savings strategy. I didn't say anything smug about it. I just walked her through the basics the way Carol had once walked me through them, because I remembered too clearly what it felt like to be dismissed by people who assumed my quiet path meant I had nothing worth learning from. My father, in the months following our kitchen table conversation, began mentioning my work at gatherings in a way that felt different from before, not louder exactly, but more accurate. At a dinner party 6 months later, I overheard him telling one of his medical colleagues, unprompted, that his daughter owned and managed a commercial real estate portfolio worth several $1 million, and that he'd only recently come to understand how sophisticated the underlying financial structure actually was. It wasn't effusive. My father has never been an effusive man. But it was correct, for the first time in 15 years, and hearing him describe my work accurately, without the diminishing qualifiers he'd always attached to it before, meant more to me than I expected it to. Even the extended family friends, who weren't directly involved in any of this, seemed to absorb a quieter lesson from watching it unfold. At a barbecue the following summer, I overheard my aunt telling a neighbor, in a slightly different tone than she'd have used a year earlier, about a young woman in her office who was into some kind of small business thing, hard to say what it'll turn into. And I watched her catch herself mid-sentence, glance at me across the yard, and add, more carefully, "But you never really know what someone's building until they're ready to show you." It was a small moment, barely noticeable to anyone else at that barbecue, but I noticed it, because it told me that whatever had shifted inside my own family had started to shift, in some small way, how they looked at everyone else too. What I wanted, if I'm honest, and what I think I actually got, wasn't for my family to feel embarrassed. It was simpler than that. I wanted, just once, for the work I had built quietly and carefully over 6 years to be seen clearly, without the filter of assumptions that had been placed over me since I was 17 years old, and told that real estate was something you dealt with, not something you could matter in. I got that. Not through an argument, not through a speech, but through a folder of documents laid calmly on a conference table, in a building I owned, in front of the sister who had spent her whole life believing the version of me that was easiest for her to hold on to. Vanessa and I are actually closer now than we were before any of this happened, which surprised me more than almost anything else in this story. About 4 months after the lease renewal meeting, she asked if we could get coffee, just the two of us, something we hadn't done in years. We met at a small place not far from her office, in the building she now knew was mine, and there was an awkwardness to it at first, the specific awkwardness of two people renegotiating an understanding they'd both operated under for their entire lives. She apologized then, properly, not for any single comment, but for a pattern she said she was only starting to recognize now that she'd been forced to look at it directly. She told me she'd spent years assuming that because I didn't argue, didn't correct people, didn't announce my accomplishments the way she'd learned to announce hers in a profession built on advocacy and presentation, that it meant I didn't have accomplishments worth announcing. She said the folder of documents on that conference table had been the first time in her adult life she'd had to sit with the possibility that her own sister had built something more substantial than she had, quietly, without asking for credit, and that the discomfort of that realization had less to do with me and more to do with how she'd built her entire sense of self around being the more capable one in every room she walked into, including the rooms she shared with her own family. She asked me, that afternoon, why I'd never told her, not defensively, but genuinely wanting to understand, and I told her honestly that I'd tried, in small ways, more tea. Han once, mentioning a closing at a family dinner, offering to run numbers on the lake house, and that every one of those small openings had been met with the same dismissiveness I'd absorbed since I was 17, until eventually I stopped offering the openings at all, because it was easier to build quietly than to keep being told, gently but repeatedly, that what I was building wasn't real. She sat with that for a long moment, stirring her coffee, and then she said something I've held on to since. She said she understood, finally, why some people choose to let their work speak instead of their words, and that she wished she'd learned to actually listen a long time before she was forced to. I don't think that conversation erased 15 years of small comments and family dinner jokes, but it mattered. It mattered a lot, actually, more than the buildings or the numbers or the folder of documents ever did. We talk regularly now, not just at family events but on our own, and last month she called to ask my opinion on a small investment property she and Dave were considering, a conversation that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier, and one that I answered the way I would for any serious investor asking a serious question, because that, finally, is what she'd become to me, and what I had apparently been to her all along without either of us fully realizing it. If there's a single thing I've taken from all of this, it's that dignity was never something I needed my family to hand me. I had already built it, slowly, quietly, one lease and one closing at a time, long before anyone else in my family knew it existed. What changed wasn't my worth. What changed was simply that the people around me finally had to see it, on terms they couldn't argue with, because the paperwork doesn't laugh at you the way a room full of relatives sometimes does. If you've ever been the quiet one in your family, the one whose accomplishments got summarized in a single dismissive sentence while someone else's got the toast and the applause, I want you to know that you don't need the room to understand what you're building in order for it to be real. Keep your documents in order. Keep your numbers honest. And when the moment comes, and it usually does eventually, let the facts do the talking, calmly, without apology. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more, because there are a lot more stories like mine still to tell.